Chapter 1. Birth and Betrayal. A new beginning, tainted by the sins of the past. Convento de la Misericordia, Ciudad Vieja, Argentina. The Convento de la Misericordia stood like a forgotten monument to suffering, its walls warped by time and neglect. The air in the convent was thick with the scent of decay, as though the building had swallowed centuries of pain and sorrow. It was a place that whispered of despair, where the echoes of past mistakes reverberated through the cold stone halls. Sister Isabel, her face pale and drawn, gripped the edge of the birthing bed, her hands trembling. She could feel the heat of the fever coursing through her veins, her body drenched in sweat. But it was not the pain of labor that tormented her. It was the guilt that gnawed at her soul, threatening to consume her entirely. She had broken the vows she swore to keep and had surrendered herself to the temptation of love and desire. Now, she was about to pay the price in the shadow of the convent's stone walls. The child she carried was a living testament to her sin, a reminder of the man who had sworn to serve God but had instead broken his sacred vows with her. The father, Padre Almeida, was a man of the cloth, a priest who had vowed to serve the Lord, but in a moment of weakness, he had betrayed not only his calling but Isabel's trust as well. As the child's first cries echoed through the room, Sister Isabel felt her heart break into 1,000 pieces. She had been prepared for the pain of childbirth, but nothing could prepare her for the heart-wrenching sound of her son's cry, the cry of a child who would never know the love of his parents, who would grow up in the shadow of their shame. "Debes callarte!" "You must be quiet," Sister Maria hissed, panic in her voice. "If anyone hears, we're finished." Isabel nodded, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she struggled to steady herself. She had never felt so alone in her life. The convent had been her sanctuary, her refuge from the world, but now it felt like a prison, a place where she could no longer hide from the consequences of her actions. The child was her punishment, her cross to bear. "¿Qué pasará con él?" "What will happen to him?" Isabel whispered, her voice barely audible as she gazed down at her son. His tiny face, still wet with birth, stared at her with wide, innocent eyes. How could she abandon him? How could she hand him to the cold, indifferent world outside the convent's walls? Maria looked down at the infant, her face etched with sorrow. "He must go to the orphanage," she said, her voice heavy with regret. "It's the only way." Isabel's heart twisted in her chest. The thought of sending her son away, of severing the bond between them before it had even begun, was too much to bear. But there was no other choice. She had no other options. The child could never remain in the convent. His very existence threatened its sanctity and the fragile order they had built. A sharp knock at the door cut through the silence, sending a jolt of terror through both women. "Open the door, Sister Maria. It's Padre Almeida." Sister Maria's face drained of color, her hands shaking as she unlocked the door. The footsteps echoed down the hall, growing louder as the Padre approached. He entered the room without ceremony, his eyes immediately falling on Isabel, who still clutched the infant in her arms. "¿Qué significa esto?" "What is the meaning of this?" Padre Almeida demanded, his voice low and threatening. "Sister Isabel, ¿qué has hecho?" "What have you done?" Isabel's throat constricted, and she found herself unable to speak. She had no excuses, no words to justify her actions. She was a woman trapped by her desires, condemned by the very vows she had once held sacred. Maria stepped forward, her hands trembling as she tried to maintain her composure. "Father, the child will be taken to the orphanage," she said, her voice steady. "Sister Isabel has repented. This need not leave these walls." Padre Almeida's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening. "Do you think this can be forgiven so easily? A child born of sin within the convent?" He took a step closer, his eyes filled with contempt. "The Mother Superior must be informed. There is no place here for such a transgression." "Por favor." "Please," Isabel whispered, her voice cracking. "Do not punish him for my sins." Padre Almeida's gaze softened briefly, but the compassion quickly faded, replaced by a cold, unyielding resolve. He turned to Maria. "Take the child," he ordered. "Make sure no one else knows. Sister Isabel will answer to the Mother Superior in the morning." Maria nodded, her hands shaking as she took the infant from Isabel's arms. The baby's cries echoed in the small room, filling Isabel's heart with a hollow ache. She watched as her son was taken away, a part of her soul slipping away with him. Almeida's gaze lingered on Isabel for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You have betrayed your vows, sister. You have disgraced this convent upon all of us. Pray for forgiveness, for your soul is lost." With that, he turned and left, his footsteps echoing down the darkened hall. Isabel collapsed onto the bed, her sobs racking her body. Once a place of refuge, the convent had become a prison, her prison. She had given up everything for a love that was never meant to be, and now she had lost it all. Meanwhile, young Luis lay awake in his cot, the baby's cries still echoing in his mind. But it wasn't just the cries that kept him awake, the strange sense of unease that had settled over the convent. For weeks now, Luis had been feeling a presence, something unseen, yet undeniably real. The shadows in the hallways seemed to move when no one was looking, and at night, strange sounds echoed through the building. The sound of footsteps where there should be none, the rustle of unseen figures. Luis had tried to ignore it, convinced it was just his imagination. But then, 2 weeks ago, Carlito had disappeared. The two of them had been inseparable partners in mischief and adventure until one day, Carlito was gone. The nuns claimed he had been taken to the infirmary, but Luis knew better. There were no signs of illness, no indication that Carlito had been sick. The truth was that Carlito had vanished as if the convent had swallowed him whole. The whispers that followed only deepened Luis's fear. He had overheard Sister Maria speaking in hushed tones, saying, "The priests will take care of him." That was all. No one spoke of Carlito again. But Luis couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The convent walls seemed to close in on him, the air thick with dread. He lay in his cot, staring up at the ceiling, listening to the creaking of the wooden beams above. The silence was suffocating, the darkness oppressive. He could hear the distant sound of footsteps in the hall, growing louder and closer. His heart skipped a beat as he recognized the familiar rhythm, the quiet, careful steps he had heard many times before. It was Carlito. Luis bolted upright, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He glanced at the door, his eyes wide with panic. The footsteps were coming closer, but no one was there when he looked. The footsteps continued, growing louder and louder. Luis could hear them now, but he couldn't see the source. His eyes darted around the room, but there was nothing. Only the oppressive silence that had filled the convent for so long. Luis was not sure what to make of it. Was it Carlito's ghost? Or was it his imagination playing tricks on him? Whatever it was, it felt real and terrifying.